What ended in the death sentence for a litany of extortion, murder, and torture charges was Daniel Lugo's devious plan to get rich quick and live the American dream. Lugo's rise to infamy began with kidnapping millionaires using hired muscle from the Sun Gym. However, this would end up getting way out of hand, as Lugo found himself guilty of a series of murders and failed abductions. This story is a wild one, containing ninja costumes, insane schemes, and lots of steroids. And it all starts here at the Sun Gym in Florida in 1993. The first character in our story is Daniel Lugo. In the film, he's played by Mark Wahlberg, but according to real-life reports, the characters' personalities were very different. Lugo came from New York and was your typical low-level con man. He'd recently been released from prison in 1991 for running a bank fraud. His crime involved impersonating a Hong Kong bank representative searching for small American businesses to invest in, seeking upfront payments in return for loan insurance. He was arrested and jailed for 15 months, and once released, he was going to turn his life around. He went to Florida to follow his passion of physical fitness. Sort of. His first job out there was actually debt collection for unpaid gym memberships, which is where we meet our second character of the story, Stevenson Pierre. Lugo hired Pierre as they were going to set up this debt collection firm, but it didn't come to fruition due to the startup costs. So Daniel went for the next big thing, working for the gym. Lugo wormed his way inside the gym by sweet-talking the owner, John Mees. Lugo promised John that he would single-handedly turn his failing gym around. There was a Gold's Gym opening around the corner, and John was desperate, so he ushered Daniel in and ignored his criminal past. Lugo got a job as a manager of the Sun Gym, which is where we meet our next two criminals, Noel Adrian Dorbal and Carl Weeks. Adrian worked part-time in the gym and was in decent shape. In the film, he was Mark Wahlberg's meek sidekick, but in real life, he was almost the polar opposite, apparently having a very aggressive personality, which was probably from the steroids. Weeks had recently moved from New York to live with his sister's boyfriend, Stevenson Pierre, to try and get away from a life of drugs and crime. The final member of the initial gang is one of the most significant, George Delgado. Delgado was a businessman, trained by and close friend of Lugo, but he also had other, more affluent connections. Before we get into the first victim, let's recap. These are the 6 original members who made up the Sun Gym gang, consisting of ex-convicts and bodybuilders, all fueled by desperation for a better life and a desire to take what they think is owed to them. Anyway, back to Delgado. Delgado had a very wealthy friend who consistently trained at the Sun Gym, Mark Schiller. Now, Delgado and Schiller previously ran a mortgage company together, however, they had a falling out over a business deal and went their separate ways. This fallout was actually due to Delgado's relationship with Lugo, someone who Schiller had, perhaps rightly, decided not to trust. Schiller gave Delgado an ultimatum: Lugo or me, and Delgado chose Lugo. This put Delgado in the unique position of knowing a lot of information about Schiller, from his illegal business activities to his home alarm code, something which Lugo exploited. Lugo had this staggering idea. He quickly called Weeks, Adrian, and Delgado in for a meeting, revealing his devious and genius plan. He told the boys that Schiller had owed him money and told them they could earn $100,000 for 2 days of easy work. The plan went something like this. The gang of bodybuilders would kidnap Schiller and transport him to a warehouse owned by Delgado. From there, they would beat and torture him until he signed over all of his possessions to Lugo and the gang. Finally, they would decide what to do with him from there, with the possibility of killing him. Armed with the knowledge of his fraudulent business, they knew he would never be able to go to police. They held the upper hand. The plan was perfect, and for a group of bodybuilders, the abduction would be the easy part, although it would not go quite as smooth as Lugo expected. This is where the story starts to get a bit ridiculous. Their first idea to plan an abduction was in late October, specifically on Halloween. Their plan was to dress up as ninjas and knock on his door, then nab him as he answered, as Schiller would be expecting children. The decided against this idea as they forgot the streets would be teeming with children and a group of bodybuilders dressed as ninjas would stand out like a sore thumb. Instead, they decided to spend the night at the strip club. They thought, right, that didn't work, we need a new plan, and this plan was even worse. Their plan was to drive alongside Schiller during rush hour on the freeway, stop his car, and drag him into their van. This was foiled when he turned off the freeway. The next desperate attempt was to hide out in his garden and grab him as he got his morning papers at 5 a.m. They dressed up in all black, applied military camouflage paint to their face, and hid under a blanket on Schiller's front yard. However, the group of bodybuilders hiding under a quilt in a garden was a little bit too conspicuous, and they got spooked after they spotted some car headlights. They got up and ran, screaming "Mission Abort" into their walkie-talkies. At this point, morale was low in the gang, with the boys filling their downtime with gym sessions and strip clubs. They were on to their 7th attempt to kidnap him at this point, and it was honestly starting to get embarrassing. This time, Lugo was determined not to miss his target. In one final attempt to kidnap Schiller, the gang decided to go head-on. After finishing his day at the sandwich shop, Schiller was walking back to his car when the gang jumped out and tased and beat him to the point where he was barely conscious. They stuffed him into the van, shackled his arms and legs, and drove him to Delgado's warehouse. Sounds of screams, beatings, and the crackle of electricity from the taser filled the dank warehouse. The bodybuilders used Schiller as their personal punching bag, with any sign of resistance met with a swift pistol whip or a right hook. Schiller had time to reflect on his life while being locked up. He was Argentinian from Buenos Aires and had moved his family to the USA in search of a safer and happier life, inevitably to escape the kidnappings which happen on a daily basis in the country. While gagged and blindfolded, he soon realized the irony of his situation. The gang had him right where they wanted him and initiated phase 2 of their plan. They made him call his friends and family, forcing him to lie, telling them that he'd ran away with a younger woman and was liquidating his assets into cash. Then, while still blindfolded, Lugo, aka Batman by the group, forced Schiller to sign away his entire business portfolio, properties and cars, essentially everything that Schiller valued in life. The gang only wanted to keep Schiller for 2 days, but ended up keeping him for almost a month. In this time, Schiller had legally signed away his entire net worth of over $1.4 million, which was then distributed between the bodybuilders. Despite being blindfolded, Schiller knew who had kidnapped him. Lugo's distinctive New York accent and Mike Tyson-esque lisp gave him away almost immediately. Now Schiller had been milked dry, it was time to dispose of him. This part of the story is even more insane than the last. Some members of the gang had actually grown to feel sorry for Schiller and tried to make him feel as comfortable as possible, namely Delgado and Weeks. In phase 3 of their plan, they devised a cover story for Schiller's death, which was revealed to him so that he wasn't too afraid. They told him they were going to put him on a flight out of the country, but he had to be blackout drunk to do so. Beaten and bruised, Schiller knew there was only one way this was going to end, but he went along with it on the slim chance that he might just survive, and if their murder attempts were anything like their kidnapping attempts, he'd probably have a pretty good chance of that. So the gang put their plan into action. They got him blackout drunk and finally took his blindfold off. They stuffed him into his car and took him to a secluded area of the warehouse district. Lugo put Schiller in the driver's seat while Lugo went into the passenger side. Lugo slammed on the gas pedal and steered the car into a concrete pole, jumping out just seconds before the car collided. The gang rushed to see the damage and found Schiller still alive. Fuck it, they thought, dousing the car in petrol and throwing a lighter to it. While they were driving away, the unthinkable happened. The door opened and Schiller rolled out the car. Unbelievable. He was flailing and screaming in the street. Lugo screamed at Weeks to run him over. Weeks drove over to him and fucking missed him. He reversed and tried again, this time hitting the target. As they looked in their rearview mirror, they couldn't believe their eyes. Schiller was getting back up. Lugo demanded Weeks to reverse and run him back over, but the approaching headlights of another car led them to flee the scene, leaving the job unfinished. The next day, Schiller woke up in a hospital with a ruptured bladder, broken ribs, and a list of other injuries. He shared his experience to anyone who would listen, but nobody believed him. A group of bodybuilders, dressed as ninjas, had kidnapped and extorted him for a month, and then staged a drunk driving accident to leave no trail. The police weren't buying this. So, Schiller enlisted the help of a private investigator named Ed Dubois, who took on his case and told Schiller to get out of the hospital as soon as possible, as the gang were likely to come and finish the job. And Dubois was right. Lugo had just finished buying a surgical uniform and was heading into the hospital where Schiller was likely to be held. He stormed into the hospital, finding out where Schiller was being treated, and planned to smother him and end this nightmare. As Lugo turned into the room where Schiller was kept, he was gone. He'd listened to Dubois and escaped to New York on a helicopter with help from his sister. He was gone, alive, and talking to his family. This posed a problem for the gang. They knew Schiller was alive and talking, but he could be dealt with later. He'd legally signed all of his possessions away to Lugo and the boys, so it was time they started to enjoy it. Lugo moved into Schiller's old mansion and bought an $80,000 gold Mercedes to drive around in. He introduced himself to his neighbors as Tom and explained to them that he and his friends were part of the CIA, so as not to arouse suspicion. The gang were living it up on Schiller's stolen money. They were buying fast cars, expensive drinks, and burning cash in strip clubs. Lugo even found a girlfriend, Sabina Petrescu. Sabina was a stripper, and Lugo told her he was a music director. While all this was going on, Schiller and Dubois were scheming. Schiller was heading back to Colombia to meet up with his family, but was telling Dubois everything he could remember about the kidnapping, including the identity of Daniel Lugo and George Delgado. Looking back to the start of the story, do you remember John Mees, the owner of the Sun Gym who originally signed up Lugo to work for him? Well, he was the notary, or witness basically, for the documents being signed. So, because the bank didn't see Schiller sign the documents, they allowed Mees to act as a middleman essentially, and this meant Mees was complicit in their extortion. This is the deed to Mark Schiller's home, and as you can see, John Mees had notarized the deed to be handed to Lugo, featuring Schiller's signature. Bear in mind at this point, Schiller was being gagged and tased at the warehouse. Schiller was almost certain Mees was doing this, so Dubois went to investigate Mees and confronted him with documents that he himself had notarized. The evidence showed that Mees was approving signatures without ever seeing Schiller, or not asking for IDs from the men signing the documents in front of him. In John's own words, he said, "Ed, you know these Latins all look alike," and Dubois, not being satisfied with this explanation, called a meeting with Delgado and Lugo to find out more. The pair ultimately wouldn't show up to this follow-up meeting and left Dubois waiting in the offices of John Mees, where he would get curious. He went through the trash of the office and found gold. The office they were in was the very office the gang had fucking planned the whole thing. The plans were in the bin for over a month just sitting there, and they had the names of everyone involved in the whole scheme, including John Mees. Delgado did finally show up and met Dubois, who was hiding the mountain of evidence in his briefcase, and made him an offer. He said the gang would pay back Schiller over $1 million as long as they agreed to not go with the police. If that sounds like a huge admission of guilt and a very stupid plan, it's because it was. Nevertheless, Dubois played along and said he'd be in touch. However, Lugo had yet another master plan up his sleeve. Instead of paying back $1.26 million, which in his mind was his money, he would alter the contract at the last minute and pay back 1.26 million Turkish lira, or around $4,000. Flawless. There was an ensuing back and forth of boring legal arguments between the gang and Schiller's legal team. While this was happening, the gang suspected that the jig was almost up and cleared Schiller's old house out. They stripped it of everything, leaving only the fridge. Dubois was growing tired of these shenanigans and opened up communications with the police. He provided the mountain of evidence he'd found and even brought Schiller back over to give a testimony, but they didn't seem to care, and they even made jokes that Schiller had given an Oscar-worthy performance in his account of the story. It was now April of 1995, 4 months after Schiller had been kidnapped. The police were still refusing to take the case, and Dubois was getting paranoid that the gang were going to strike again, and he was right. Back to the gang, Adrian had finally won the affection of a stripper he was in love with at the club. He'd been flirting with her for months, and finally, she brought him back to her apartment. She was called Beatrice Wayland, and she was beautiful, but there was one problem. Due to the massive amounts of steroids Adrian was taking, he was having some issues performing in bed. Basically, he couldn't get hard. In an awkward state, he started to look through photos at his girlfriend's apartment and noticed a man dressed head to toe sitting on a Lamborghini. After asking who it was, Beatrice told him it was Frank Grieger, the richest man she knew, and he lived right here in Florida. A light bulb moment for Adrian. Frank was a very rich man, originally from Hungary, who made millions in the phone sex business alongside his wife Christina Furton. Adrian begged his new girlfriend to set up a conversation with Grieger, and through a line of contacts, he'd successfully set up a business meeting between Grieger, Lugo, and Adrian. This was under the premise that they had a phone-related business proposition, and Grieger was interested. They rolled up to the meeting in Lugo's gold Mercedes, wearing freshly tailored suits and Mark Schiller's stolen Rolexes. They entered Grieger's mansion, and Lugo did the talking. He sweet-talked Grieger with promises of massive profits and limitless growth, but they wanted serious investors only, and were looking for a minimum of $1 million as investment. Grieger was so hooked, he asked the pair, "Can I invest more?" which was met with beaming smiles from the pair. On the way home, Adrian would keep repeating, "The future looks bright, but the star that burns twice as bright burns out twice as quick," and the burnout was coming. When they got home, they put together the following kidnapping pack. It included the classic rope, gun, and taser, but this time included horse tranquilizer Rompin, which will be important soon. The next day, they packed their car, and Lugo and Adrian started to cruise towards Grieger's mansion. They were giddy, laughing to themselves and excited about the millions they were about to make, but the night wouldn't turn out how they would expect. The duo met Frank and Christina at a restaurant, and after their meal went to Adrian's townhouse to have some drinks and talk business. While Lugo and Christina were in the main room watching TV, Adrian and Frank would retreat to the bedroom, where things would start to turn sour. Soon enough, the sounds of arguing and banging would fill the apartment, coming from the bedroom. As Lugo and Christina rushed to see what was happening, they opened the door to see Adrian choking Grieger, who had a massive open head wound. Christina let out a blood-curdling shriek, but was quickly gagged by Lugo, who then injected her with the horse tranquilizer. She passed out almost instantly, and they gave Frank the same treatment, but they overdid it and gave him a lethal dose. Frank was dead, and they hadn't taken any of his money. They threw him in the bathtub while the rest of his blood drained and called Delgado to help clean up. They needed at least something from the murder of Frank, so they asked the drugged up Christina for the keypad number to their locked home, where Lugo had sped off to after she gave him the combination. However, as he hurriedly keyed in the numbers, they were incorrect. In a rage, he phoned Adrian to get Christina to confirm the numbers. However, he heard a harrowing sentence he never wanted to hear. "The bitch is cold, Danny," and Lugo just collapsed. The plan had failed spectacularly. He still had 2 dead bodies to deal with and nothing to show for it, except Grieger's Lamborghini, which Delgado stole while the gang were at the meal. The next day, they rented a U-Haul and transported the bodies back to the infamous warehouse. Once the bodies were there, the plan was to use a chainsaw to cut up the bodies, something Callum Van Moga may have drawn inspiration from when he disposed of a kangaroo in a similar fashion. This seemingly straightforward task would fail miserably. As they assembled the chainsaws, they forgot to add motor oil, which caused it to burn out instantly and break. They shoved the chainsaw back in the box and demanded a refund from Home Depot. They then opted to buy an electric chainsaw, which worked first time, although Adrian was not the brightest bulb, and he got the chainsaw jammed with Christina's hair. Fuck it, they thought, and proceeded to use a hatchet to finish the job. To minimize the chances of any remains being identified, Lugo made a makeshift barbecue and stood outside the warehouse grilling the hands and feet of his victims. They then ended the day by putting the bodies in the welded shut 55-gallon drums and throwing them into the river nearby. It was now the end of May 1995, and the Sun Jim's gang's spectacular downfall was about to begin. At 7:30 AM on the 31st of May, a friend of Frank Grieger's spotted his car on the road, which was impossible. Frank had recently been reported missing. He chased the car and saw a bodybuilder driving it and instantly recognized him as Frank's potential new business partner, Daniel Lugo. He contacted police with this information along with Dubois, and the case was finally taken seriously. They called Mark Schiller back to give yet another interview, 2 months after they initially dismissed him, and it all started to make sense. The police issued arrest warrants for Lugo, Adrian, Delgado, and John Mees. They successfully captured them all the next day, except for Lugo, who had fled to Nassau in the Bahamas, sensing the inevitable. 5 days later, Lugo was captured at the Hotel Montauk and bundled onto a commercial flight back to the USA. He was greeted with a wall of police and squad cars, to which he asked, "Is this all for me?" Adrian, who had previously been Lugo's second-hand man and his biggest admirer, sat in handcuffs and watched the news play the footage of his arrest. They eventually found each member of the gang guilty to some degree, with most of the members serving jail time to various degrees. Adrian and Lugo felt the brunt of justice, both receiving death sentences which are yet to be carried out. Lugo appealed in the late 90s but was rejected, and so is waiting for his final day.